Okay. So, Jessica, if you can hear me, and Nancy, you can hear me. So I've got a teleprompter I'm going to use. Okay, welcome everybody. So in this webinar, we're going to continue to create a knowledge base in our congregation that you can use to protect and turn out the 2020 vote. And this is time urgent at the federal level. Nancy Pelosi will have some leverage to get safe, fair, and secure voting policies into the next relief bill, which is being worked on right now. But she hasn't said she's going to allow voting into the bill. So there's ways we can put pressure on her. And there's lots of actions going on right now in states around the country, and we need to stay on top of them. And there's a lot of work to be done to get ready for November. And we need to take the best actions from home that we can every week. So Nancy Whittier, if you could put the agenda into the chat, it's very simple. So I'm going to take about 5 minutes going over real quick, what is vote at home and why is it important? And then Nancy Sardeson is going to talk about lessons learned from Wisconsin, including the court decisions that impacted what happened there. And then the last piece we'll present will be our work at the church, what we call USNF, the vote, how that's going to go forward, the strategy. And then we should have plenty of time for questions and discussion. All right, so let's see. All right, so the last, okay, so as far as questions or comments, why don't you just put them into chat, and that would be great. And I think if you type in capital letters, either just the letter Q or C, or type the whole word question or comment, then when we're scrolling through the chats, we can sort of flag who wants to talk about, who wants to make a comment, etc. So I'm gonna start my 5-minute piece in 10 seconds, but first I wanna thank Nancy Whittier, Molly Hale, Susie McCrae, and Harriet Diamond, because we all work together to, get this to where it's at right now. And the idea for this, can I call it a Zoominar? That's Nancy Sardeson came up with that, getting, I suppose, inspired and fired up from what happened in Wisconsin. Okay, so what is vote at home and why is it so important right now? So I think there's 2 reasons why. So if we don't take strong and smart actions, many people won't be able to vote in November. We need to have more vote by mail, more vote at home. And a second reason why this is so important to be studying and thinking seriously about is that there are actually vote at home policies that suppress the vote. And we have to be smart about what actions we support. But if it's done right, vote at home has been shown to definitely increase turnout, and that's among all groups. Okay, so what is vote at home? So there's a lot of terms in use, and the easiest way to understand vote at home is to see it as progression through 5 levels. And there happen to be a few states who've made it all the way through. But most states are somewhere on that path. 36 states actually have some form of what you'll see in a minute. It's called no excuse absentee voting. So there's a ton of great information available from a group called the National Vote at Home Institute. And Nancy Whittier, if you could pop that link into the chat field. And everybody who gets the digest, because you're on our Google group, this link also appears in there every week. It's called the National Vote at Home Institute. All right. So Jessica, if you could put the PowerPoint, I'll pop over to the screen. Yeah, you got it up. Great. Thank you. Okay. So level one, you need an excuse to vote absentee, and Massachusetts, unfortunately, is one of 9 states at this level. There are things going on we can talk about later to get to the next level. So level 2 is you need an excuse with an exception. So a good exception might be we're in the middle of a pandemic, but some states have already either governors or legislators have said, no, that's not an excuse. So that's one of the things we need to do in Massachusetts is, yeah, it is an excuse. Another excuse in some states, if you're over the age of 60 or 65, that's an exemption from requiring an excuse. But it's pretty simple. You need an excuse, but there's some exceptions. Level 3, actually no excuses needed, but you have to request a ballot for every election. And there are actually 23 states already at level 3. So that's pretty good. And 7 states are at level 2. So level 4 is you're pretty far along the road. And we'll talk later about some hiccups that can happen even if you've made it to level 4. But level 4, you request an absentee ballot once. And then as long as you don't move, you automatically get a ballot every election. And 6 states in Washington, D.C. are at that level. And by the time you're at level 4, you're pretty well along. The statistics show states that are level 4 have a lot more people voting from home than voting in person. Okay, now level 5 is full vote at home, and that means you automatically get a ballot delivered to your home to every election. And by the way, I want to say quickly, I want to keep this fairly simple, but there's a lot of different layers to this. And one layer is that turns out a lot of people don't want to mail in their ballot, even if they have it at home, they fill it out at home. So in level 4 and level 5, some states, and it really works very well, they've got secure drop-offs and voting centers. So a lot of people just feel better about taking their ballot instead of putting it in the mail, handing it in that way. Okay, so that's my piece for now. And I just, we've all seen that Wisconsin is a kind of a case study of how messy and dangerous voting can get. So Nancy Sardeson is going to tell us about that and what we can learn. Nancy.
Okay, well, first of all, some of my interest in all of this is twofold. One of them is that was a voting rights lawyer, so election law was one of my first and foremost legal things that I did in my life. But the other important piece of it is that I was born and raised in rural Wisconsin. And it's my home state and one that I was, up until a few years ago, quite proud to be from. It's the home of Fighting Bob LaFollette and the Progressive Farm Labor Party. Senator Gaylord Nelson was my senator for many, many years, and he's founded the first Earth Day, which will be 50 years on April 22nd. 1970 was the first Earth Day. And what makes Wisconsin also really important is that it was, it's the swingest state there is. There is no more swing state than Wisconsin. It has 2 senators. One of those senators is Tammy Baldwin, an out lesbian, one of my law school classmates, and she's been a senator now for, I don't know, at least 10, 15 years. And then they also have Ron Johnson, who is about as right-wing as they come. I think he's someone who said that it's okay to die in this, with the COVID. So for many years, it was a very, very progressive state. And it actually then, after Gaylord Nelson, came Herb Kohl, one of the more benevolent billionaires I've ever known in my life. He was a Democrat owned coal stores, owned the Milwaukee Bucks, was definitely a billionaire. And then when he retired, then came the Koch brothers. And the Koch brothers dumped massive amounts of money into Wisconsin in like the 2010 election. And that brought in Governor Scott Walker as the governor of Wisconsin, and things rapidly went downhill from there. And in the 2016 election, Wisconsin is likely the state that gave Trump the election. He only won Wisconsin by little less than 23,000 votes. And there were a lot of issues in Wisconsin. Wisconsin has one of the stricter voter ID laws. That is obviously a voter suppression technique, and that's been in place for a very long time. And it's also a state that has pretty significant gerrymandering. There's a large majority of Republicans in the state legislature, despite the fact that the state is more 50-50 kind of when it comes to voting, which you can see when you look at the two senators. They're like polar opposite senators. They couldn't be more polar opposite. In the 2016 election, while it swung to Trump by the 22,000 vote, it also elected a Democratic governor, Evers. And the state legislature, however, remains heavily Republican. So that sort of sets the stage for what took place on April 7th for the election, the primary election, which I'm going to assume that a lot of you all know something about what happened and the fiasco about it. But what makes Wisconsin important, not only because it was the first state that we actually got to see what would happen with this Supreme Court and how they would rule on a voting case, because Kavanaugh was not there when this Voting Rights Act was gutted. So this is a new Supreme Court doing voting election laws for the first time. So what happened in Wisconsin? The primary was scheduled for April 7th, as it was in many other states. And Wisconsin's the only state where the state legislature refused to change the date. All other states changed that April 7th date. If you recall, at that moment, this is a sort of still the moving target. Moving into that April 7th election, lots of things were happening very quickly in terms of the COVID stuff. And so there wasn't a whole lot of time, but people started to see the handwriting on the wall, both Republicans and Democrats, but mostly Democrats, and we're talking about absentee ballots, which in most situations, okay, so absentee ballots. David just ran through what it takes to get an absentee. In Wisconsin, to get an absentee ballot prior to this whole fiasco that took place, to get an absentee ballot, you had to upload a picture. If you were going to do it online, you had to upload a picture of yourself and also get it witnessed. Now, I'm going to assume that most of you sitting out there are going to say, how do you get something online witnessed? Which is really where many people ended up. I mean, how do you do this? As the COVID stuff started happening and the stay-at-home order, I think it was, I can't remember, I think it was like March 12th or so that Governor Evers did a stay-at-home order in Wisconsin. So things were moving in rapidly, and people were saying, okay, we got to vote at home. We need to open up this absentee ballot thing. It's a disaster because people need a lot of technology. I think most of us would feel relatively challenged if we had to upload a picture of ourselves and then also get a witness somehow online and do all of that to get the absentee ballot. So the state legislature did go through that. Anybody who requested an absentee ballot could get it. And there was a lot of, on both sides of the aisle, we're talking about more and more, get these absentee ballots. So Wisconsin went from like 22,000, 25,000 requests for absentee ballots to over 1 million in the course of about 2 weeks, which it would overwhelm any system, but it really overwhelmed the Wisconsin system. It was well over 1 million ballots, and there was no way this was just becoming clearly a real problem for this primary. The primary, while most of us think of it being for the presidential election, in Wisconsin, it was really much more than that, because the balance of the state Supreme Court was at issue in this case. And that was a huge election. As well as, there are tons of local elections. Actually, the Court of Appeals in Wisconsin elects judges. That's something most of you may find as odd. But Wisconsin does elect its judges. The Supreme Court in Wisconsin is elected for 10 years. Circuit court judges, all of them are all elected in what are considered nonpartisan elections, but obviously there's a lot of partisanship that goes to it. So there was a lot at stake in this election. In other words, the balance of power in Wisconsin was at stake, and so it was a very, very important election. The state legislature, which I said is overwhelmingly Republican, would not change the date. Governor Evers asked on several occasions. They debated it for a total of 17 seconds in the state legislature, and they refused to change the date, including going into the last few days before the election. So then Evers asked the legislature to send everybody a ballot. Every voter should get an absentee ballot. And they also said no to that. So Evers is now in this position as we're going towards the election. We're days before the election now. 2 days before the election, Governor Evers declares the election postponed until June 9th, which is when most states that had the election date for April 7th postponed it to June 9th. So that was a typical date, and it was the date by which absentee ballots and there would be in-person voting on June 9th, and absentee ballots could take place during any of that period of time. So that was by executive order. Well, needless to say, the Republicans very quickly went to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court, this is the day, the Wisconsin Supreme Court said, one second, I'm running out of battery here, I gotta put this in. The Wisconsin Supreme Court rejected Evers and said that he did not have the power to do what he did. He didn't have the executive power to do that, which is in and of itself kind of ludicrous, because these are emergency powers that he was operating under. And I don't know that there would be many people who would argue that COVID-19 wasn't something that one couldn't use their emergency powers for. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court decision is very contorted as to how they got to the fact that he didn't have the power to do this. Which is just a legal thing that I'm not going to get into. But when the Wisconsin Supreme Court made this decision, we're talking the day before the election. The evidence that was presented to the court was that it was known that there were at least 185,000 absentee ballots still outstanding that had been requested and had not been returned. They also knew that there were almost 30,000 absentee ballots that had never even gotten sent out by the local jurisdictions. It's all online now, so there's a lot of how you could determine whether people had got their ballots or not gotten their ballots. But again, leading up to the week before the election, the post office, the Secretary of State's office, the local election officials, everything was just totally overwhelmed by the system. And so all of that evidence was presented to both the Wisconsin Supreme Court And then at the same time, right after, within minutes of Wisconsin Supreme Court ruling that the election had been suspended, telling him that Evers didn't have the power to change the election, so the election was now on. They went to federal court. So an important issue in election law is the fact that elections are run by local parties. So it's very much a state issue. And the only jurisdiction that the federal government has in an election is if there's a federal official on the ballot. Of course, there was, because it's a primary election. So that's the only thing that allowed the federal courts to even get involved in it whatsoever. Otherwise, it's a state court issue. So I speak from experience of because I was doing voting rights, which meant that it was a federal election all the time. This is a really big issue, that you don't interfere with state elections. The federal government really doesn't have jurisdiction to do this whatsoever. It's up to the states to be able to do it. But because there was someone on the ballot, the Republicans sued. So literally the case before the Supreme Court is the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party is what it is the name of the case. So the Republicans go to federal court, and they're at that point they're requesting. This was already filed, but now the Supreme Court has said there's no election. So now the Democrats take over the Fed. This is very complicated stuff. So the Democrats take over the argument, and they're arguing that they should at least now postpone the election, counting the ballots and letting all these absentee ballots that we know are out there, let those be counted on April 13th. So give it a week. Give it a week for these absentee ballots to come in, at least, because the Supreme Court the Wisconsin Supreme Court has said the election's going forward. The Democrats are now saying in federal court, okay, the election's going to go, but let's let these absentee ballots go for a week. The district court, which would be the lowest court in federal courts, said, yeah, you're right, okay. So they held it off. They put an injunction on the counting of the absentee ballots for a week, so that all these ballots could get in, because there was no one that was saying that it wasn't a problem in terms of how many ballots were outstanding, and clearly people, lots of people had requested them but didn't get them in time, or if they returned them, they hadn't gotten in on time, or whatever. It was known to be a significant number of ballots were still out there. So an injunction was placed by the district court, so federal court. The appeals court upheld that. It now goes to the United States Supreme Court. And interestingly enough, because it's the Seventh Circuit, Brett Kavanaugh is the person in charge of taking on the Seventh Circuit, so determining what to do with these cases as they come up from these various federal circuits. So Brett Kavanaugh says, okay, we'll hear the case. And the Supreme Court, in truly one of the most contorted ways, first of all, there isn't one word in the majority opinion of the Supreme Court that even talks about the situation that's out there, that there's a stay-at-home order in the state of Wisconsin, that there's all these absentee ballots that are outstanding, that we're under emergency circumstances by anybody's definition of an emergency, we're in it on April 7th. And the Supreme Court gets into this extremely contorted technical issue over whether or not the absentee ballots could be postmarked, had to be postmarked by April 7th. And if they were postmarked by April 7th, then they could be counted by April 13th, when that date was okay. The April 13th, waiting a week was okay, but the whole Supreme Court case was over postmarks. Now, what I really want to emphasize here is that this is a really contorted way of coming up with a decision, the decision that they'd already made, because Wisconsin does not, in its election law, define what a postmark means. It doesn't in any way require that something be postmarked by that date. It just says that it has to be in the received by the date of the election. Well, that was already done. That's not before the Supreme Court. That was fine. It didn't have to get in until April 13th. But they said it also had to be postmarked by the date, April 7th. Totally doesn't even begin to make sense. And actually, it's legally wrong because Wisconsin doesn't set that date. They don't have anything that says when it has to be postmarked by. Obviously, it would, in most circumstances, it would have to be postmarked by the date that it comes in, the date of the election. But when it comes to this situation, is it April 13th or is it April 7th? So the Supreme Court comes up and says, nope, everything has to be counted by that day. This is all taking place the day before the election. Thousands, tens of thousands of Wisconsin voters are left with, I requested an absentee ballot, I either sent it in or I didn't even ever get it. Whatever it is, it's not being counted. My vote is not being counted. And some people didn't know that was happening. Other people did know it was happening. And now it's time for people to go to the polls. And you've all seen what happened on that day. It was pretty amazing, because one of the problems that took place in that election was that the actual in-person election was that the city of Milwaukee, which is a working class factory town, primarily Democratic, although there are inroads by the Republicans into Milwaukee. The city of Milwaukee, which is by far the largest city in Wisconsin, normally had 182 polling places, but they could only get polling officials for 5. So Milwaukee County went from 182 polling places to 5. That's incredible. That's an amazing thing. And I don't know if you've seen pictures of what happened in Wisconsin, but there were lines. Some people were in line in Milwaukee County for 5 to 6 hours waiting to vote. And if you have anybody that you want to honk your horn for today, it would be to those people that stood in line in Wisconsin for 5 to 6 hours, some of them 2 hours. Not all places did the 6-foot to 10-foot distancing. Some people were right next to each other in the voting. And the election took place. But votes did not get counted until April 13th. And lo and behold, this is a testament to voting and getting the vote out, because the progressive candidate for the Wisconsin Supreme Court did win, which literally, there's a picture of it right there of the lines that took place. This is in Milwaukee County. Disparate impact on Black and brown people in the city in the state of Wisconsin. There's no question about that, because it's in the cities. Actually, Black and brown people really only exist in the cities in Wisconsin. And those were much more difficult much more difficult to get absentee ballots from, and people are more used to voting in person. But it did happen, and that the progressive woman did win the Supreme Court case, or did win the Wisconsin Supreme court seat in the end. So the end result was good. Nothing will be litigated out of Wisconsin because of it, which could have been the case. That obviously the Democrats dropped all their cases that they were going to bring against Wisconsin, and so nothing will end up being litigated out of this. But there are a lot of lessons to be learned in Wisconsin. When we discuss mail-in voting, we have to, first of all, most states do not even begin to have the ability to get those absentee ballots, and they've put up that list of what it takes. You have to have excuses and various other things, and what you don't have in there is even things like Wisconsin, which requires the picture requirement. These are pretty onerous requirements in getting an absentee ballot. Many states are people who are advocating for the mail at home, because I don't think there are many of us that feel that by November we're going to be real comfortable all going and standing in line with each other in voting. So there's the implication of everybody getting these absentee ballots. We're going to, one, overwhelm the local election officials that have to send these out and count them, because it takes a lot more to count absentee ballots than it does machine-fed elections. And second, the Postal Service was absolutely 100% overwhelmed. They did not have the ability to process all of the ballot coming to people and then also doing it. And the whole thing, I mean, there were bins of ballots sitting around. The story is just horrendous. So there's a lot of things that come out that are really important for people to remember as we advocate for mail-in voting, that these glitches that we saw in Wisconsin get fixed. That needs to start now. The kinds of things that are necessary for mail-in voting to take place, vote at home, whatever it is called, those things need to be take place now. And I don't know, Jessica, do you have that slide, or anybody have that slide of, just quickly to show you? I can give you this link if anybody can put that slide up, which I don't see coming up. But this is just an example of, this is some of the election law stuff that I participate in and whatever. This is kind of hard to see, but it's state by state what each state has to do to put itself into compliance to be able to actually pull off mail-in voting in November. And as you can see, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that has to take place, and it starts in April. In order for this to happen in November, which in my opinion, I don't know how else we do it, but for this to take place in November, we have to be advocating in every state for this to take place. This isn't a national issue. It's a state by state issue, because elections are run by each state. What was Trump's first response, of course, is to not support the Postal Service. If the Postal Service goes down, this is all over. I don't even know where we begin if the Postal Service isn't fully funded and able to keep going. That breaks apart. But so the advocacy at every state has to take place to make. There isn't a state that would be okay for November right now under their current laws to make, excuse-free absentee voting take place, which is what Vote at Home is advocating for. A lot of work to be done to get us to November. And where we're going to go from here, Dave?
Okay, so Nancy's really put the frame around the picture and showed us all how tough the situation is. I've been spending a lot of time over the past few weeks following all the actions going on around the country. And although I'm not going to put a rosy face on it, there are a tremendous amount of things going on. And I'm just going to give you a couple quick examples and then tell you about the strategy that we're proposing to use at our Unitarian Society. So I've been on a couple of webinars, for example, with several secretaries of state from different states. And they are sharing information at the detail level and really helping each other out. And so the 5 states that are furthest along, Colorado and Washington and Oregon, Hawaii, Colorado, no, anyway, there are 5 states. And they're being just like missionaries, those secretaries of state and those governors. So that's one really positive thing. And then another really positive thing is every progressive organization that I know of that can fit voting into its set of actions is doing it. Everybody from Move On, Indivisible, Swing Left, et cetera. There's a coalition in Massachusetts that's working quite hard and quite smart to get COVID-19 as an acceptable excuse, and they already have that done through the legislature for September primary, and so on and on and on. So I'm going to summarize our strategy for going forward, and then I'll go through a couple of details. Yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and some of it's at the state level. There are so many actions, dozens, if not hundreds, popping up every week. So we think the way we can be most strategic and helpful is to sort through those actions and identify the ones that look like they're the most effective week by week and mobilize our congregation to take those actions. And we're quite powerful. What are we, more than 300 people? And each of us has friends and relatives in other states. So that's thousands of people. And you know how that multiplies and multiplies. It's all about organizing. It's about mobilizing. So I don't know. I'm just seeing it as if we don't try our best on the day after the election, we could look back and say, gee, we didn't even try. So that's where I'm coming from. And now I'm going to just review more specifics about how we're going forward. So I know some of you were involved in the work we did when we could show up at our building with the Vote Forward parties. We turned out, we sent in over 1,400 letters to voters in swing states to encourage them to vote, and in some cases to help them register. And then COVID hit, and we had already been working, some of you, maybe all of you, attended the March 8th service when Nancy Sardeson and others spoke about voter suppression, and we had a plan to work with a group called Reclaim Our Vote to help voters who'd been kicked off the rolls get back on. So around March 15th, we started quickly looking at the plans that we had to go forward with Vote Forward and Reclaim Our Vote. And we kind of said, whoa, because they weren't really doing enough. And over the next few weeks, we found they're still not quite doing enough to adjust their strategies so that they really are helping people be safe in voting. So I mentioned the folks before have been most active on this. So several of us have been trying to put our brains together, and we've come up with the idea of really focusing hard on working at the state level and the federal level to get things in place so that vote at home can be a reality for as many people as possible in November. And so what we're doing, and I know many of you are on the Google group, but some of you aren't. So Nancy Whittier, if you could put my, I'm not looking at chat now, but make sure my email address is on chat, because what we're doing is every week we're putting together this weekly digest. We did our first one a couple of days ago, and we're going to make it concise and practical, so you'll see the best actions you could take. We're also going to provide some background information. So that's one of the main things we're going to be doing, is summarizing and identifying the best actions, and they're changing week by week. It's really incredible. So so that's one thing we're going to be doing. And because I'm posting this as an individual, I'm putting up links to organizations that are taking sides politically, like Indivisible, Swing Left. So there will be, partisan as well as nonpartisan activities on there. So let's see. Yeah, so I think, we only have about 15 minutes left. Maybe now would be a good time to open things up, and I'm going to ask Jessica Harwood to help unmute, and folks, if you want to be seen, that would be great. And we can actually, I guess the first thing to do would be to see what has been up on chat. See how to do that. See if there are any questions. We'll start with questions that are on chat.
Everybody should now be able to unmute themselves if they want to speak, and you should hopefully be able to turn your videos on if you'd like. If you can't turn your video on, you can send me a message in the chat.
Okay, so we have one, let's see. Actually, we don't have a lot on chat. So Jessica, how do you think the best way to get people to raise their hands, so to speak? How should we do that?
Probably the easiest thing to do is go like this. Some of us were practicing last night. You can digitally raise your hand, but people just want to.
Okay, so let's get on a gallery view, if you could find that, and whoever has questions or comments. I keep forgetting, and I'm just going to say one more thing because I've been talking too much. Reminding myself that as members of the Unitarian Society, unlike other activist organizations I've been part of, or organizations that have lots of activists, it's really okay to express how you feel. And if part of what we do tonight is just process how we're feeling about all this stuff, that could be a positive thing. But I would also love to hear, questions people have about the details and action-oriented stuff. What can I do? Okay, I'm going to shut up. Who's raising their hand? Tina Ingman. You got to unmute yourself, I think, Tina. Okay. There you go.
Good. All right. My camera's in a different spot, so it's weird. So this is a big kind of dumb question probably, but are we trying to do this for November?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, good.
You bet.
All right.
The chips are down for November. No, it's not a dumb, there are no dumb questions. Who else has a question or comment?
Looks like Nancy Sardeson.
I just want to say that of all the actions of everything that I talked about, mail-in voting and the different things, get out the vote is still the most important thing. Because even though those people risked their lives to go out and vote, they got out and voted. So people went out and voted. And getting people out to vote is how November is a better November than it was 4 years ago.
And I'll quickly comment on that. In the next week's digest, one of the things we're finding is tons of actions around supporting the Postal Service. So the mechanism to help people get out the vote is, one of them is going to be to have a way people can mail ballots in and get ballots mailed to them. So you'll see that in the digest. And if you're not on the Google group, please consider sending me an email and we'll get you on, and you can see there's 5 actions I'm putting in the digest, how to support the Postal Service. Who else has a comment or question?
Looks like Harriet.
I do.
Harriet.
My question is, so in Massachusetts, we're asking, it sounds like the question about anybody can get a ballot and use COVID-19 as an excuse.
Not quite yet, not for November. That is true for the September primary, where Markey's running against Joe Kennedy. That was passed in the legislature. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting. Finish your question. I've been learning a whole bunch of this stuff.
No, that's very interesting. But I guess my question is, are we working to get COVID-19 as an excuse in November, or are we working to get a no excuse ballot? And how do we do that?
Great question. So lo and behold, our UU Mass Action folks, Laura Wagner, that team is part of a statewide coalition. And I got to sit in on their meeting last week. And this has most of the progressive organizations in Massachusetts, everybody who are working together to amass political power to influence the legislature. So Harriet, what I'm saying is, I think our first port of call on this, our first place to look is to see what that coalition is going to do. And I'm going to summarize that, and then you're going to turn my summary into something for the Sunday Times.
Right.
Yeah, so I'm going to summarize their strategy. They have a 2-page letter they're sending to Galvin, and actually it's to DeLeo and Spilka to influence the legislature, and it's more. I'll just say it's definitely more than the COVID-19 as an excuse, but that is a major piece. I don't think they're going to push for no excuse. I think that's too heavy a lift. Okay, I'm going to stop talking. Who else has a question or comment? Hey, Nancy Whittier.
Just want to say, we are monitoring how these organizations that we were working with before and other organizations are developing their strategy. And I'm optimistic that one of the anti-voter suppression organizations will develop a strategy around what we can do to help people absentee vote in swing states. So as soon as we have something to recommend to you around that, we will. They're kind of in the thick of trying to figure it out, just like we are.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a great point. Okay, Susie McRae.
Thank you, Nancy and Dave, for helping clarify what we can all be doing, because I think people are feeling not a little overwhelmed and not quite certain. So I guess what I would actually propose is that we all look for ways that we can articulate what's going on. And so we kind of look to some of you who are really clear on this, and I thank you for what you've done, but also within the congregation, but also within our community and our broader community. anything that people can share that helps us be able to motivate others, and help people feel like there's something that they can do right now. And I think of, well, Nancy had mentioned that MVP played a role in Wisconsin. I'm looking at Charlotte and Chris, who wrote postcards every day to voters in Wisconsin. And we got to believe that that all made a difference. And so I mean, Dave, the digest is wonderful at giving people ideas on what they can be doing, and the more that we can be doing. And so I think that may lead to your next question in the poll of what can USNF the Vote be doing to activate people?
Yeah. That would be great if folks could respond, maybe even personally. What would motivate you or your friends? What do you think would help motivate you? Yeah, I'll just stop there. Susie's asking us a good question. Molly.
It also looked, just to put it on the agenda, it looked like Chris had a hand up earlier.
Oh, thank you. I missed that. Chris, then Molly, huh?
Okay. Well, so Nancy mentioned that get out the vote is still really important. And some of the groups that we were working with, well, for example, Vote Forward, that's what they were doing. And we have this backlog of letters that we were going to mail in October. But I'm wondering if, actually, I haven't looked at those letters, so I don't know. But I'm assuming that get out the vote letters would have outdated information, because they're going to be telling people to go to a certain polling place or whatever that may not actually be operating, or there may be different rules with the mail-in voting. So I guess we would still have to be monitoring which groups are doing get out the vote, but in the context of all the changes. But
well put.
We don't even know like what the changes are going to be in some states. So how do we know? I guess they'll know what to do.
There really is good information coming out every week. Unfortunately, there's also a lot of confusing and bad information. So I'm going to put in a quick plug. It's Molly and Susie McCrae and Harriet and Nancy and I have been working together. Plenty of room for other folks. We can figure out how to divide the labor, because I would love to have several of us with a plan going through these dozens and dozens of emails and websites, because to Molly's point just now, staying up to date week by week, what each state is doing, the progress they've made along the timeline that Nancy Sardeson showed us, it's actually possible to stay up with that stuff. It's a lot of work. We can do it. So anyway, Harriet.
Wait, don't forget Chris.
I'm sorry, Chris, then Harriet. Thank you, Nancy.
Mike, it was more of a comment in that with Trump unfunding or taking funds away from the post office, could he just defund the post office? Would he want to get rid of the post office?
They're actually running out of money in June. He does want to get rid of them. Go ahead, Nancy Sardeson.
For the vote. I mean, so that we can't do vote by mail.
Yeah.
That would be my take on his reasoning.
Yeah, exactly. Nancy Sardeson has an answer.
Privatizing the Postal Service has been one of the big union busting things that's been going on for several years. They want to privatize it. It has a very strong union. And just to throw out there for a piece of trivia, 10% of the workforce in the USPS are military, and many of them are disabled military people. So that's something you can throw out there for the to support. But it's also it's been a huge union busting thing. They front loaded their pension. I mean, the Republicans have been trying to privatize the Postal Service for a long time. Now Trump is saying, you know, we're definitely going to do it, and he's not going to put any money towards it, which it absolutely needs to have.
Yeah.
So this is a crisis.
So when you see the actions in the digest, I'm sure there are even more and better actions. I think it would be great if, I mean, we've got 19 creative minds right now, right here. Please be thinking about how can we support the Postal Service, and be on the lookout for the best ways to do that. And let's mobilize and do that. Okay, Harriet, I think you were next.
I just have a quick question, which is, we were working on voter registration, and that kind of became impossible due to the fact that we weren't sure that what we were sending out was up to date, for one thing.
Right.
But is there any effort to encourage people to register to vote in some of these like counties of certain states that is more like public service announcements, or some way to get to these people, because there's a point at which they can't register to vote anymore? And I'm not quite sure, I mean, if there is anything like that, but you might have seen something like that.
If I could jump in, how about you and I work together?
Okay.
Okay, can you put a thought together and just send? Okay, so my wife Susan just handed me a note, which is really important. So there's a big movement going on right now to buy stamps. Just go on to yeah, USPS.com. And there's also a lot of other items that you can buy. It's going to be fun. In fact, everybody keep their eyes open, and I bet you'll see some United Way thermometer kind of thing. People just spontaneously, but it's also being mobilized, as you'll see in the digest, to do this. This is a grassroots thing. How we can fight Trump's effort to, go ahead. USPS.com. That's the U.S. Post Office site. Okay.
Yay.
Oh, Susie, yeah?
Send more postcards.
Yeah, amen.
I don't know if they make money on them, but maybe they don't. Somebody needs to research that.
No, there's you got to put a stamp on the postcard. I'm sure they make money. Okay, who else? So we're at 5 after 8. We could sort of go to next steps, but I don't want to discourage any further comments. Okay, Nancy Sardeson.
I just want to, when you talk about registering to vote, no matter how we vote in November, people have to be registered. Purges are taking place. All of that stuff is still in play. That hasn't changed at all.
Right.
The purging of rolls, keeping people registered, getting people out to vote, getting them excited about going out to vote. And one of the great things, if this actually gets going to do vote by mail, is that we're going to be able to see, like in Wisconsin, you could track all these absentee voting because it was online. So you can tell if people's votes have been returned. It's actually much better than it used to be. So we have to be vigilant though, because what I tried to really impress upon people is that the United States Supreme Court and our federal government currently will do everything in its power, including making incredibly contorted and actually legally wrong decisions to support the current administration.
Yeah. So that's a great, go ahead, Susie. Were you waving? You're on mute.
Yes, because Nancy was saying making sure that people are registered, and we had previously had some discussion on that, and the concern that in many states people can't get registered without going in person. So what efforts can we be doing?
Yeah.
You know, we
Yeah.
sent postcards previously to tell people, make sure that they're registered.
So,
We
if I could jump in, we need to proactively reach out to Vote Forward, to Reclaim Our Vote, and to the other leading voting activist organizations who, in our assessment, weren't yet quite up to speed on safety for COVID-19. We need to reach out to them proactively. And any of us can do this. I'm going to start pushing it so that we can, you know, push on them and say, we need, and we're ready to be working on voter registration. Help us do it in a safe way. Okay. Yeah. I mean, that's just my quick thought. Okay. So what other kind of closing comments might folks have? And then I'd like to put in one next step piece at the end. Okay, I guess I'll go ahead. You all know where to find me, and I would prefer to have a more democratic kind of online forum, but I personally don't know how to do it, and folks were complaining about too many emails on the Google group. So what we're currently doing is send me emails, and I'm kind of digesting and collating ideas to put them into the digest. We do have a steering team. Some of you folks are on it. I'm going to be talking to folks about how we can get more regular meetings and have a really strong foundation for USNF to be working not just ourselves, but with all of our friends and relatives in swing states and through all of our networks to be doing all this important work. Nancy Whittier, you've been doing a lot of work on this. Do you have anything to add, or Molly or Susie or Harriet before we close?
Just, you know, if there's anyone else who's here who wants to help us figure out strategy and join the steering team, please let one of us know. And otherwise, you know, we welcome your participation at any level.
Amen. Okay. So great that you all made the time to show up. It was so great to sit at Nancy Sardeson's feet and hear all the level of accumulated wisdom and experience there. Jessica, anything to say? Oh, Joan O'Brien, go ahead. You're on mute. You're on mute, Joan.
Oh, am I? I thought I unmuted.
You just unmuted.
Okay. I really just wanted to thank those of you who have taken the leadership role and are trying to organize all of this. I mean, I'm in awe. I feel like at the moment I barely have time to even answer an email, but you're out there doing this, and I just want to say thank you very much.
Yep, thank you.
You bet. You're very welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all. Molly.
Could Dave and Nancy and Susie stay on for just a minute afterwards? I just have some steering committee stuff to talk about with you.
Great.
And just so you all know, I'll put this video recording onto the USNF YouTube station.
Great.
I'm going to stop